My Lords, I'm glad we've got the chance to debate this first inquiry report, because there's a lot to say. Now, we all have our own experience of the pandemic, and we've heard some earlier today. My own experience is bracketed by two events. It's bracketed at the end by my own resignation from government. I am, I think, the only person in HM government, either a minister or official, to have stepped down in protest of pandemic handling, and specifically against vaccine passports and the prospect of a further lockdown in December 2021. At the beginning, it's bracketed by having watched the near collapse of the government machine in Downing Street in early 2020. There has been, in my view, much largely unreasonable vilification of ministers' and officials' behaviour over the pandemic period, and I want to put on record that personally I can't forget the courage of those who turned up to work in those difficult days, believing at that time they were risking serious illness or even death. Those people deserve commendation for doing everything they could at that point to live up to their responsibility to the nation and to keep the government going. Now, between those 2 points, while I was trying to run a trade negotiation, I saw a lot of the decision-making on the pandemic. I haven't been asked about any of this by the inquiry. So be it. Like others, I'm not particularly impressed by what I've seen of the workings of the inquiry so far, and I can't share the warm words that I've heard earlier today. The inquiry's conduct so far seems to me to have lacked something both in seriousness and in real intellectual curiosity about the pandemic. I hope I'm proved wrong as subsequent reports emerge, but I fear that this one rather bears out my concerns, and I want to begin by saying why. First of all, there's something unsatisfactory in producing a series of effectively interim reports rather than an overall judgment. Inevitably, the early reports will beg lots of questions. It is, after all, difficult to judge the first report without a clear understanding of what the inquiry's view is on other important questions: the effectiveness of decision-making, the effect on the health service, the impact on the economy, and so on. And indeed, it's not even clear to me that we're going to get from the inquiry what we really need: a report on the costs and benefits of measures taken, factoring in the economic and social costs. And if the inquiry doesn't produce it, then I think the government must. Meanwhile, what we've got is a report that tells us that much went wrong in pandemic preparation. But of course, the inquiry can only reasonably reach that conclusion if it's confident that deaths in the pandemic were actually worse than they might have been with better preparation. This report doesn't actually tell us that, it just assumes it. Perhaps the evidence is going to come later in the future reports. But meanwhile, we've got the conclusions without any of the workings, and I find that methodologically really quite unsatisfactory. Now, let me turn to some of the conclusions and recommendations. I am going to be quite critical, but I want to begin with one important and positive attitude of the report: its criticism of groupthink and its recommendation about red teams in government. Groupthink was, as noble lords have said, very obvious in some of these decisions. It is easier said than done to make red teams really effective, but I hope new ministers will take this recommendation seriously, and perhaps not only in this area of policy. Now, I have three concerns about the report's conclusions and recommendations. The first is a point that's been touched on already: the report's heavily reported conclusion that, and I quote, "we prepared for the wrong pandemic." Now, the report uses those words in its executive summary, but it never then repeats them in the main text, which makes one suspicious, of course, that they're for popular consumption, not actual analysis. To my mind, and I'm not the only one, and I share my noble friend Lord Lansley's reservations on this point, the report never makes clear why the inquiry has said this. It's certainly not obvious to me. After all, the 2011 strategy was expressly designed to address all respiratory viruses. And WHO advice from even this year says that COVID and flu, and I quote, "spread in similar ways, many risk factors for severe disease are common to both, and many of the same protective measures are effective against COVID-19 and influenza." So it's not clear why flu is in any way actually a bad proxy for the pandemic that we had. To the extent one can assess what's meant from the report's verbiage, it's possible that what the inquiry means to say is that the government was wrong to prepare for a pandemic of which the spread could only be mitigated, not contained or prevented. But after all, the spread wasn't in the end contained or prevented. So it's still not obvious why the 2011 strategy was, in the inquirer's view, such a poor one. Now, understanding this properly is really crucial to future planning, and I'm afraid I don't think we do understand it properly on the basis of this report. My second concern is on the recommendations for structural change. It's undoubtedly true, I fear, that, as the report says, ministers and officials failed to learn from planning exercise or to implement their conclusions. I'm afraid that's just normal life in Whitehall, a standard cultural feature and one we had to fight very hard to overcome when we were planning for a no-deal Brexit. But of course, you can't generally change the culture just by changing the structures. So that's why I find it surprising that the inquiry has focused so much on this in its proposal to scrap the lead department model and to move responsibility to the Cabinet Office, a department widely recognised, I think, to be one of the least effective in government. Now, I can see how people with little experience in public administration, like most of those staffing the inquiry, might think that issues involving many government departments should be managed from the centre. But after all, everything in government is cross-government, and not everything can be run from 70 Whitehall. I fear the consequence of this recommendation will actually be to disempower departments which really have the expertise and the resources, while producing no extra coherence and direction, only duplication. For similar reasons, I've also got concerns about this proposed independent statutory body that's recommended in paragraph 693. It obviously is the case that responsible ministers need a good mechanism for consulting and remaining in touch with a wide range of experience in pandemic management, and I would add outside this country as well as within it. But I fear that the effect of creating what is in effect just another quango will in practice be to remove planning from politics altogether. We'll have the same situation that we've got in many areas now, when a quango makes recommendations which are just disconnected from the real choices that actual governments have to make, choices about trade-offs on risks, about costs, about resource constraints. And yet, ministers end up by having no real choice but to accept those recommendations or be accused of overruling technical advice for political reasons. That's not satisfactory and it won't help us get things right in future. My third comment is on something the report doesn't say explicitly, but which is quite obvious from reading it, and it's certainly obvious from those of us who lived through it in government. That is that one major reason for complexity, duplication and uncertainty in the pandemic response was the complicating role of the devolved governments. Now, I doubt very much that anyone thought back in 1998, when we created the devolved administrations, that the devolution of public health as a competence would have the end result of travel bans between England and Wales, or Scotland operating in effect its own and different entry control system to third countries during the pandemic. Now, the report does in fact hint at this problem by proposing the new quango I just mentioned should have a, quote, UK-wide remit. It understandably refrains from going into detail why. I'm not quite so constrained, and I think that proper management of public health in emergency conditions requires decisions to be taken at a national level for the whole country, that the government should have brought in legislation to that effect in 2020, and that it should be made possible in future as soon as we can. Now, my Lords, I want to draw one broader conclusion. It's my concern this report falls into the trap that so many inquirers fall into, of believing that cleverer people, more information, more preparation, better planning, if done properly and rigorously, can solve problems. And if those problems aren't solved, that's ipso facto evidence of poor preparation. The report recommends, for example, some might think ambitiously, that, and I quote, it should be a fundamental aspect of all risk assessment that the potential impacts on society and the economy are taken into account, end quote. Now, you don't have to be a complete devotee of Hayek's explanation of the knowledge problem to think it unlikely that even the most efficient government is going to be able to foresee and respond to all, quote, impacts on society and the economy. There are limits to what planning can do. Now, of course, we should do the best possible. But what is also needed is something else, an adaptive and a learning government, one that can assimilate information, draw conclusions and alter course in the light of real-time developments. And unfortunately, we didn't have that during the pandemic. Instead, I'm afraid, we had a culture of compliance and denial, making it impossible to learn from experience. So when it decided to lock down in spring 2020, the machine kept doing the same thing on autopilot. It wasn't just unable to assess the trade-offs between lockdowns and the economy, it was unable to assess, assimilate, explain basic facts like the fatality rate, the effectiveness of vaccines, their effect on transmission, the effect or lack of it of vaccine passports, the effectiveness of face masks, and much, much more. And above all, it failed to draw conclusions from the evidence and adjust its approach. Instead, until the whole COVID world collapsed in January 2022, the first and last recourse was always to lockdowns, like a brain-dead animal still moving with instinct, as if it was still alive and thinking. Now, the Minister said in introducing the debate that the intention in future is to create a learning department, a learning system, one that can respond. But of course, unless you change the wider culture in society, that's going to be quite tricky. And of course, there were plenty of individuals who at the time resisted exactly that learning. The then responsible ministers are, of course, some of them. But they aren't the only ones. Most of civil society, trade unions, faith groups, including the Church of England, all pushed for the most risk-averse policies possible. All other political parties pressed for more and tougher lockdowns, more working from home, more public money, more debt. And to take just one example, the current Prime Minister said in July 2021 that, I quote, lifting all restrictions at once is reckless, and doing so when the Johnson variant, let's not forget that shameful use of language, doing so when the Johnson variant is already out of control risks a summer of chaos with deadly consequences. That never happened, not for the first time and probably not for the last. He turned out to be talking nonsense. But all the others advising the government at the time must also take responsibility. The second lockdown was publicly justified through figures and charts which were simply wrong when presented and shown to be so immediately afterwards. They never learned. Even as late as December 21, these advisers were predicting disaster. The then Chief Medical Officer said on 16 December that large numbers of COVID patients ending up in hospital was, I quote, a nailed-on prospect. The UK was, quote, facing a really serious threat. The then and current head of the Health Security Agency said Omicron represents, quote, possibly the most significant threat we've had since the start of the pandemic. Anyone who looked at the data from South Africa, as has been said, knew these statements were wrong. We certainly know it now. Now, this behaviour could persist, this is my final point, because there simply was not properly free political debate about these issues. Many governments leaned on social media, tried to terrify citizens into losing their faculties in support of their approaches. We were not allowed to discuss obvious things, like the obvious plausibility that the virus emerged from a lab in China. We learned what happened from the Twitter files. We also know it now from Mark Zuckerberg's letter of 26th of August to the House Judiciary Committee in the US. And I quote, the Biden administration, including the White House, repeatedly pressured our teams for months to censor certain COVID-19 content. I regret we were not more outspoken about it, says Zuckerberg. I also think we made some choices that with the benefit of hindsight and new information we wouldn't make today, end quote. As I keep saying, most disinformation, most misinformation comes from governments, and that culture was set during the pandemic, and it needs to change. That's why it's so important to avoid not just groupthink in government, but to promote free debate more broadly. I think we can be proud in this country, and the Conservative Party, I think, can be particularly proud that in the end we broke through that cycle of risk-averse controls and repression. Debate in this Parliament could not, in the end, be stifled. And we should be glad that Boris Johnson, in the end, reached his own judgment about lockdowns, refused to go with the flow. That decision broke the spell and the cycle of lockdowns. It showed the rest of the world that the control and prevention approach was fundamentally misconceived. It would have been better to stick to the 2011 plan, so criticised in this report. It showed it wasn't necessary to keep repeating the same actions and expecting a different result. But by then, the damage had been done, one thing that is surely clear, even from this quite unsatisfactory first inquiry report, is that we must never repeat it.
Yeah.